Welcome back. So another Tom Clancy book, still going through the Jack Ryan universe, looking for hints on did he get help from people or not. We just finished this one, the 800 plus page monster that is executive orders. Comes right after Dead of Honor. Jack Ryan is the government, basically. Um, First things first, this book is towards the end of those that were actually written by Tom Clancy. He started working with other people and co-authoring things and eventually passed away, and people are still writing in his voice. But at this point, he was a guy with a lot of access at the highest levels of government. I mean, way up there. He really kind of, and in the previous book, he really destroyed the entire federal government at the end of Dead of Honor. And I think in this book, it's sort of Tom Clancy's dream of how to build it better, because I think he had this idea that we are a great nation, but we lack something at the top, and maybe we need to fix it. So in the last book, he gave us a lot of warnings about highly concentrated amounts of power, things like the Federal Reserve, certain congressmen and senators putting chokeholds on things, the president putting chokeholds on things. And I think in this book, he wants to rebuild from those ashes of let's destroy the old and go in with the new. And he kind of does that. So I think this is part his dream and simultaneously part a warning to us of what could happen globally if the United States is not um, strong and sort of unified in a lot of ways. So a very long book, very complex. So this may take a while to go through, but I think it's also very important to the world we face today, because if you looked at Dead of Honor, it was all economic warfare, trade wars. What's going on today? And that led to a shooting war that led to other things because the United States was seen as weak. And the so the book was released in 1996, so it's set in sort of 96 through 98. It really is a transition for Clancy out of that. Hey, let's kind of talk about the exact world that we've got, and let's kind of transition into where might we be going. And he was always a guy who was really good at looking sort of around the corner and maybe a little bit into the future. But I think this time he looked a little bit further into the future, because remember, Dead of Honor after 9/11 got a lot of attention because it was a 9/11 style attack, and this one is sort of rebuilding from those ashes. But the book opens up with now President Jack Ryan having just been sworn in, and looking at still the sort of fiery remains of the Capitol. Because if you remember at the end of the previous one, a 747 was flown into the Capitol when Congress and Senate and the former president were all having a meeting. Um, and the Secret Service want to get him on a plane. Jack's like, no, 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 we need to kind of stay here and actually be seen here in DC, looking around at what happened. And it sounds a lot like George Bush with the megaphone after 9/11, right? So he went to New York shortly after, a couple of days later, but Jack did it a couple of hours later. So it was a little bit different, but it's very reminiscent of things that actually happened. So maybe it's just an obvious political move, but I found it kind of eerie that that sort of, hey, let's go stand on the smoldery remains and do, offer that leadership moment. We're there, whether that you call that pure propaganda or whether you call that leadership, whatever you want to call it. It was in the book and it happened in real life, although with a different timing. Now the situation for Jack is an absolute kind of worst case scenario in this case. After the attack, there's no Supreme Court left. All of them were killed. So if you have to deal with something in the court system, how do you deal with it at Supreme Court level? You can't, so you get into the Supreme Court. Congressional losses were staggering. Senate basically wiped out. Cabinet gone. Very few survivors from that Capitol attack, and it was a joint session of basically all the important people in Congress. Think about it like a State of the Union, where we have that lone survivor guy who's out there, right? Well, actually, kind of took place in this book. This might have been the impetus for the show, I think. But in this novel, is this novel an idea from something? Like as I read it, I kept thinking, is this novel really an idea from someone inside the government that kind of whispered it to Clancy and was like, hey, this is our nightmare scenario, man. What would it look like if this happened? And because it's a ludicrous level of chaos. Imagine what would happen if we didn't have a Congress, a Senate, a Supreme Court, and we basically had a guy who would just become vice president sworn in as president. Everything changes, right? You can't pass a spending bill. So let's say, our government has been running on continuing resolutions kind of forever. What happens if you run out of money? What happens if you have a debt ceiling problem? You can't pass a law because there's not enough people. So you've got a real problem if something like this takes place, and it makes you question when we get all those people together for meetings like the State of the Union. Why do we put them all in one place? It doesn't seem to make sense, except for like the deputy of Secretary of Agriculture or something. But anyway, um, in many ways, most Tom Clancy books are not just sort of one problem, and this was no exception. There's a lack of a federal government, there's lack of leadership challenge, but there's also a biohazard incoming. There's never a dull moment in Jack Ryan work, right? So it's not like, oh well, Jack's just got to rebuild the government. Well, how many other countries in the world would see that moment and go, all right, time to go, right? We're going to go do something that the United States would normally stop us from, but now they're kind of distracted. So the entire world is looking at sort of the smoldering remains of our federal government. And many of those who don't like us very much saw it as opportunity space, right? Let's go start some shit and get in trouble. And let's see the United States come try to stop us now. Ha ha, they can't, they're busy, right? Well, we've been world police for a long time. If we can't do it, we can't do it. Clancy even tries to bring terrorists back into play by showing and discussing how one person willing to die and take out others with them can really advance a political agenda. And he's absolutely right. Somebody willing to die and do it in a spectacular way it can actually advance a political agenda. Wish it wasn't that way, but it is. And we see that happening more and more around the world, basically every single day. And we even saw it recently where um, a medical insurance company CEO was murdered on camera, and people are siding with the guy who murdered him. And what did that actually advance an agenda? Who knows? But it certainly got attention, right? And when he had things against that insurance company, it certainly got attention. I'm not advocating that, but it does do what some twisted individuals think it's going to do, and our desire to consume flashy news is sort of what drives that. If our government is ever put in this kind of a position, though, what really happens around the world? I mean, do we really have a world that's sort of kind of we're sort of keeping things at bay, and then all of a sudden just kind of blows up, right? And I think this book was Tom Clancy trying to tell us, hey, the United States, stop being so divided, start being more unified, because the more divided we are, the more dangerous the world actually becomes. Because if we can't get along here and we have no unifying voice, how does the rest of the world kind of take that? And in the last however many months it's been, we've seen a lot of us in the midst of chaos, and we've seen stock markets up and down and all over the place, and all kinds of sniping going on. There hasn't been any new shooting wars, but it could happen if we're seen as distracted. When does taking the world policeman out of the equation become a time for just sort of crazy stuff going all over the place? And given the events of the previous book, Debt of Honor, and the attack on the Capitol, having originated purely from Japan, uh, Jack has this sort of point that he makes is like, how long before we start having public issues related to ethnicity? And if you remember, Tom Clancy was a baby boomer, and in World War II, we actually did round Japanese people up and put them in camps. It happened here in the United States during that time period. So saying, oh, it can't happen. Well, it did, and it happened not that long ago. Could it happen again? Well, every political cycle, I seem to hear another group of, oh, they're going to put us in camps. Well, it can happen, but, until it does, we can't really make that claim. But, that is something that's happened before. Now, the other thing that came to mind was how long before Jack Ryan, having a real constitutional challenge on his hands, is faced with multiple insane lawsuits, but really just nonsense, right? So in the situation that took place in this book, Jack had been kind of sworn in as vice president because the previous vice president resigned. And how long before lawsuits start flying? Like, oh no, he shouldn't be president because he had been sworn in for like 2 minutes, and that didn't really count, right? And he actually technically hadn't even been sworn in, but yeah, he was nominated. So it's like, how long before lawsuits start flying? Because you basically just took out the entire chain of command up there. So, but you can't deal with it because you have no Supreme Court, right? There's a bit of a problem. And how fast can you actually get a Senate or a House of Representatives put back in place? What can you really do without those bodies? Can the government actually spend money beyond what's already budgeted? Can you actually have something besides a CR or for a short-lived time window? Can you raise the debt ceiling? Can you dispatch troops? If you don't have if you got to go solve a military problem, and it's not falling within the current budget, usually that's an extra budget that comes in. Well, what if you have to do one and you can't, right? It really would be the ultimate test of us as a nation if something like this ever took place. In the middle of everything else, being faced with now that one of the enemies has said, "Oh, let's go after the U.S." Well, the enemy in this case decided to use an Ebola outbreak, start a global pandemic in the middle of the United States being greatly divided. That kind of we did have one of those, right? So it was kind of eerie reading about it. Now, in this one, it was not nearly the same extent as COVID was, and it got handled much differently. But what happens when when the president decides, okay, travel ban, right? You got to wear masks, all these other things. Clancy does hint at a long sort of believed notion that given how long the United States has played world police, if the perception of us being weak, shit here could fall apart. Shit around the world could fall apart. And on a side note, I do think part of season one of the streaming show was actually influenced by this book because of that Ebola outbreak. It sort of, if that sort of showed up in streaming one of the show that's on Amazon Prime. And as we got deeper into the book, we see Jack Ryan, a character Clancy always said was sort of based on himself, leading the effort to rebuild the federal government from the literal ashes. And I think Clancy was saying maybe that the way things have been going for a long time, we're just not sustainable, right? We're just not on the right track. And perhaps it was just an idea for a book, but perhaps there were some people, in DC who were whispering to him because he was connected pretty high. But one way or the other, Clancy nailed it again, right? He kind of got a whole lot of things exactly sort of right. The only problem is no one in DC is as well intentioned as Jack Ryan. So if there's something like this did happen, would you have somebody who's well intentioned, or would you have somebody who's opportunistic that tried to do the job? History suggests one of those is going to be true. So the concept, and Clancy does bring this up at great length, and he's done it in a couple of books, of us being world police or other countries being regional policemen. That only works as long as we have the moral high ground, right? And it doesn't work. We have to have that moral high ground on a consistent basis. And if we let that go, we're no longer the trusted global police. We're no longer trusted to do the right thing. And we have to keep that moral high ground, or we're no longer going to be that world superpower. We'll have the military, sure, but we're not going to be that group everybody goes through to be the grown up in the room when there are other problems. And Clancy does bring up the notion that a pandemic created as a way of fighting a war is actually worse than nuclear war. And you put someone or some group inflicted with a strain of Ebola. Let's say you had a strain of Ebola that was survivable in the air for a lengthy period of time. Ebola is 80% fatal or something. So let's say you had one that was transmissible by aerosol and it lived in the air for a reasonable period of time. Great. Infect 20 people and put them on airplanes, right? See where it goes. Send them around the world. How do you have to respond to that to actually deal with it as a nation or as a globe? And Clancy got pretty close because it only hit the United States. It didn't hit the entire planet, but Clancy got pretty close. He brings up a point that's concerned for a while. What happens to the delicate balance of powers if nations, if someone in the Middle East decides to start grabbing land and we're busy with a global pandemic and no president, and then there's a land grab going on. What happens in all those cases? And he, the thing about the pandemic, I'm going to get back to in a second, because I think Clancy was trying to make a point in this book and well in the previous one, that the way we handle economics in this country is a little bit messed up. We've got a Federal Reserve with basically an enormous amount of power that nobody really understands exactly what they do and how they do it. We got a tax code nobody understands, because Clancy does a whole couple of chapters for like 100 pages on his choice for Secretary of Treasury about just how absurd our tax code is. And the code is so complex that not even those working for the IRS can like full claim to actually understanding it. And I looked up the numbers because I'm like, how bad can it really be for somebody to fully understand the tax code? And can somebody actually claim to, I fully understand all of it, and I do, and I promise. And Clancy was kind of warning us that it was pretty bad and needs to be fixed. And this was back in the 90s when it was about 2/3 the size it is now. So how big is it now? I looked it up. The tax code is now 6,871 pages as passed into law. But the interpretation of those pages is roughly 75,000 pages long. So there's no one individual that's going to say, I know it. It's not possible. And how do you ensure when you've got a document that's long, that's that long? How do you ensure one section doesn't contradict another section? That's a ludicrously large tax code. So there's a whole section about, let's go fix that problem with some method of tax that doesn't make all those special exemptions and loopholes. And hey, all the rich get away with paying a lower rate. Blah, blah, blah. That's because there's tons of loopholes built in. Like, how do we actually get rid of all that and build a tax code that makes sense? And he does a whole section on that. And he's right. That does need to take place. And humorously, Tom Clancy goes through this process of rebuilding the government. He does a chapter from the perspective of a lobbyist, um, as all the new lawmakers are coming into town. And when the lobbyists show up and they're like, hey, let's go talk to these politicians. They're like, the politicians don't want anything to do with them. So the lobbyists are like, oh, those guys need to understand who really runs this town. And Clancy, I think, was kind of giving us this tongue-in-cheek version of maybe the lobbyists shouldn't be in there so much. And I kind of agree with it. But again, it's another way to say the dude gets it right. And this may be a 900-page book, but he's gotten so much stuff correct that you're just like, holy crap, this guy is so on it. And just as Jack is getting in the swing of being president and starting to get things put together, there's this bioweapon release in the form of Ebola, and the United States has to go deal with this bug. In this case, it is transmitted by breathing, so it's aerosolized. There's a domestic terror group off trying to do something at the same time. He's got to go deal with something going on in the Middle East. He doesn't have a Congress, he doesn't have a Senate, he doesn't have a Supreme Court, and now he's got to go deal with these kinds of problems. There's even a scenario in the book that talks about China and Taiwan arguing with each other about, should there be one China or do we have this sort of dual state thing going on, which is a problem that's still going on to this day. Tom Clancy does make a point of saying that the U.S. president and the United States appears weak if they appear weak because there's a lack of unity behind them, and when in the midst of political chaos, the global implications are widespread. It makes the world a much more dangerous place. So, like, we're trying to negotiate. Currently, the United States is trying to get in the middle of a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. We're not unified by any stretch of the imagination. We are just not on that particular topic. And our president seems to be all over the map, and people are either behind him or they're not, or they're in the middle going, what's going on? We've got whiplash from all these changes. And that has global implications because it says we can't go in and really make a difference in those peace talks. We can cut off military aid, sure, but we can't necessarily go in and at least from a position of authority or moral authority, get in the middle of that because we can't even agree on what it should be ourselves. And not that we should be the ones that go and tell the countries what to do, but we can't really help much if we can't even agree. Now, as the Ebola outbreak is discovered, Tom Clancy basically describes what I found this interesting. This was written in the 90s, right? So I had to go look a bunch of stuff up again. As the Ebola outbreak is discovered, Tom Clancy basically describes gain of function research as a way to cause a widespread outbreak of a deadly disease. Never been, take a disease that's never been before aerosolized, make it that way, and add some functions to it, which sounded a lot like COVID. Now, the book was written in 93. It came out in 1996. And I was like, come on, really? Did he get this one right? Because it was kind of the problem with COVID. His previous versions of COVID weren't really transmitted as easily. They existed in bats and other things. All of a sudden, we've got this one that has this other weird stuff in it. And I had to go look it up. Deliberate gain of function research really started in 1993. This was released in 1996. In 93, they were doing something with polio viruses and engineered into something else. And it's too close, right? It's just too close to what he's got in the book that says, hey, maybe he was talking to somebody who was looking at that gain of function research because he just nailed it again. And it's a problem we had that might have been behind part of COVID, whatever your position is on that. But again, the dude just nailed it years before it actually took place. So he nailed, you know, tax code being too complex, COVID, all kinds of other interesting things. This book for 900 pages, I got to admit, it didn't feel like that. But also, it's another example of Clancy just absolutely getting stuff right, even 20 years before the event took place. So it really makes me think somebody was whispering to the dude. He was connected high enough, and maybe they were just whispering in his ear saying, "Hey, what if?" And he took it and ran with it. But man, he's so close to reality, going back and looking at it again. Now, to deal with the outbreak of the disease, President Jack Ryan shut down public assembly places. Sound familiar? Restaurants, schools, that kind of thing. Or tried to. Shut down interstate travel. We said don't travel. He just shut down, no interstate travel. Don't leave Texas. Don't leave Oklahoma. Just stay where you are unless you're a truck driver. And even trucking, he shut down to some level. Remember, it's fiction, and you could actually get away with it. But remember back to COVID when they were like, "I'm not doing that." Uh, his staff actually instantly brought up the constitutionality of that decision. Of course, there were lawsuits flying around, but Jack's point was, what matters more, the freedom of assembly or the freedom to life, right? So the Constitution is life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, freedom of assembly. So if you take somebody's freedom of assembly away, but you guarantee their life, you kind of, which one of those matters more, right? So the Constitution kind of argues with itself on that one if you're posed with a situation where you have to pick which one of those you're allowed to keep, right? Um, and it was an interesting way to think about it. But I could do whole hours on that topic, but I will. But if you think about the other stuff that goes on in this book in Dead of Honor, man, it's just on it every time. Now in this book, they assumed and kind of proved the leak was declared an act of war. So the viral leak, of course, the intelligence agency saved the day, and they declared the use of a virus as a weapon as an act of war. Now, interestingly, COVID, look at it, it has now been admitted by a congressional committee to be a lab leak. Was it an intentional leak or not? Nobody's been able to say. That's been backed up by a bunch of other people. Take it for what it's worth. It did leak out of a lab, even if it didn't. But let's say it did, and we could prove it, and we could prove it was done as an act of war. What's our response? It's a weapon of mass destruction. And the United States has always held the line, or at least made the statement that if you attack us with a weapon of mass destruction, we're going to attack you with a weapon of mass destruction. We only have one kind, that's nuclear. So do you go nuclear in response to a viral attack? I mean, how do you deal with it? So yeah, again, it did bring up a topic that I think a lot of people have thought about, in that if we were attacked with a bioweapon, let's say COVID was a lab leak, let's say COVID was a weapon, how would we respond? And they had to figure that out in the book. So it touched on a lot of things that we've actually seen kind of flow since the book came out. A lot of craziness in this one that made me kind of go, holy crap. But the difference between this fictional world and ours, and the reason I think people actually paid attention to Jack as the president, was you could trust him for flow of information. You could believe when somebody was up there talking, they were giving you as much information as they could, and they were doing it honestly. And you can't say that about Washington, D.C. today. I mean, you get one topic, you get both parties to say 180-degree opposite things, but they lawyer phrase it so that, really they're both saying exactly the right thing, but, they've played with the language enough so that both are really right, but it just sounds completely different. And you can look at both statements and go, wow, that's right. No, that's right. Well, really, they're both right, but one's meant to get this group of people worked up, one's meant to get this group of people worked up and get them to fight each other. So it's what it is. Now, Clancy does hint at a world, also, and this was the last little closing bit. Clancy does hint at a world to go take care of this, to go take care of the people who launched the virus. Clancy does hint at a world that would be better off if the United States and Russia could get along. He's right. The United States and Russia getting along would be great for world peace. We'd have to agree on a lot of things, and some stuff would have to change. But The United States and Russia getting along would be great for world peace. Whether or not that's ever going to happen is beyond me. But this book, between the financial stuff that it goes through about how lobbyists run the world and they shouldn't, the tax code is over complex and it shouldn't be, how too few people get to make too many decisions that they kind of mess with people, and how bioweapons are actually a possibility and not a good one, but could happen. Again, I'm looking at it going, somebody was whispering to this guy. There's just no way. Too much in too few books have come along and kind of said, yeah, he was getting help from someplace. Now, this book is book 10 in the Jack Ryan series of books. I have currently read 6,308 pages of these books, trying to find proof he was, or at least hints that he was getting help from somebody, and I think I found it. Um, Next up is Rainbow Six, which is set in 1999 through about 2001. It's about a anti-terror group that is more John Clark focused than Jack Ryan focused, but read it before, but it's been a long time, so I'm really looking forward to this. And after that comes The Bear and the Dragon, which is incredibly long. Um, so we will see you on the next video, but I think this one also drives home that Clancy was getting whispered to by somebody, and then he would take it and run. And whether he knew he was a government asset or not, he was at least getting people to tell him stuff. And those people talked, and he picked up the information nuggets and ran with them, and did it in a highly entertaining fashion. So I hope everybody has a great day. Apologies for the coughing. One of those days. We'll see everybody on the next video. And, Tom Clancy Executive Orders, read the book if you haven't. It is the 10th in the Jack Ryan series. If you don't want to read a book that long, it does have an audiobook available. So check it out today. We'll talk to everybody on the next one.